Joining me this hour is Steve Malenga. He is a George M. Yeager Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a senior editor for City Journal. He writes on financial issues and public policy. And I reached out to Steve to get his take on where much of the country's large cities and states are going financially. Everyone is rightly concerned about the impact of COVID-19, but to make the right decision, we have to address the root of the problem. And in many cases, COVID is the accelerant, not the fire starter. So I start the interview by asking him about the uncertainty of many cities' financial health and what part is COVID related. Here is his response.
So essentially, first of all, you talk about the situation, the uncertainty, and uncertainty is definitely the enemy of government, even more so than it is of the private sector, because government has to deliver basic services, and it's not like you could just stop, let's say, collecting the trash, for instance, or it's not like you can just stop teaching kids, although there's been a bit of that going on too. And so, COVID created this very, very volatile situation. The real question, though, is to what extent what COVID did was create the situation, or, as you say, merely accelerate it. And let me talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of talk right now in Washington about the next level of aid package, and the states and cities, municipalities are looking for a lot of money, up to $1 trillion. And governors in particular are arguing, including Pritzker in Illinois and Cuomo in New York and Murphy in New Jersey. They are arguing that essentially what they want unrestricted budget aid, because there's been this tremendous drop in tax revenues in a bunch of places, although not everywhere, and we can talk about that. There's been this tremendous drop in tax revenues. And essentially what they're saying is it's all because of COVID. And they should, and the government should, federal government should essentially help them because of that. But there's a counter argument going on, and the counter argument is this: a lot of these states, and Illinois is a good example, New Jersey is another one, and a lot of cities, and Chicago is a good example here, and San Francisco might be another one. They weren't really very fiscally responsible even before COVID. And in fact, I did a piece about a year ago, before anyone knew that there was going to be anything like COVID, based on what some estimates that some financial experts were making on what the next recession was going to look like. In other words, everyone was saying, well, we've got a 9-year national expansion going on. Sooner or later, there's going to be a recession. That's the way things work. What's it going to look like? And some of the numbers that people were projecting for places like Illinois and New Jersey, and the warnings they were making were very, very dire numbers. The irony is that we got another recession. It was COVID-induced. And now the debate is, to what extent did COVID actually, is it responsible for these tremendous declines? And to what extent are the problems that many places are facing the fact that they were not adequately prepared for the next recession, period, no matter when it came and how it came? And that's a big debate, because there are governors who are essentially saying it's all because of COVID. And then there are a lot of outside analysts who are saying, no, you were in lousy position now. Illinois has the most debt of any state in the nation. New Jersey's right behind. Even before COVID, even before the recession, even during the expansion, these states were not fully paying all their bills anyway. So what do you expect? And it's really quite a mixed bag, actually. If you read the newspapers, or if you might just assume that everybody's in the same position, but that's not true. There are actually states that have a surplus right now. There are other states that haven't had to make very big cuts at all because they had big so-called rainy day funds. They were really prepared for this. And then there are places like, New Jersey, which is out borrowing billions of dollars to bolster its budget, not billions of dollars, to build new roads, or billions of dollars to build schools, which is what you usually borrow for, but to bolster its budget. And there are places that are looking to raise taxes, like New York, which is already probably the most heavily taxed state in the country. And yet Cuomo said yesterday, we have to raise taxes again because we can't otherwise continue to operate as a government. So the landscape is not uniform by any means. And the really big debate is to how much of this was the fiscal mismanagement of individual places coming up to this, and how much was it of COVID alone?
And he's right. That is the question. How much is one? How much is the other? It's a little bit of both. But we know that a good deal of the problem is mismanagement. Many places, like obviously Illinois, where they focus too much energy on legislation and increasing revenue and place so little focus on how the funds are allocated, that you just stay in this continual cycle because you keep trying to find new ways to get money in, but you're not paying attention to the fact that no one's managing it. You're blowing it. You're wasting it. It's being stolen. And so I asked Steve how these places that we're talking about that were struggling financially before COVID got into the position in the first place, as we talk about finding the root cause. My guess is that it had a lot to do with what I call the P word, pensions. But here's his response.
Yeah, certainly. You can make an argument, and I've said this before, that let's take Illinois and New Jersey have not legitimately balanced their state budgets, even though they both have constitutions which say every year we're supposed to balance our budget. They have not legitimately balanced their budget in more than 20 years because they did things like they didn't make their full pension payments, or they used one of the common tricks, if you will, is that the bills you get in the fourth quarter, let's say for Medicaid, your bills for let's say your providers, your doctors and so forth, you get them in the fourth quarter, but you don't pay them until the first quarter of next year. And that makes you helps you balance your budget in 1 year, but it just pushes, and so you're it's a form of a pyramid scheme, actually, So states did things like that. And there's actually a study that was done by the Pew Center for the Research for State and Local Research. They identified about a dozen states that over the last 20 years have not legitimately balanced their budget. New Jersey was number one. They basically calculated looking at, that for every dollar they spent, they only actually collected 91 cents in revenue, but they used tricks like not fully funding their pensions, or some years not just spending anything on their pensions. So in general, the large issue is a different kind of gimmicks, which essentially build up debt. And whether it's, borrowing to put money into your pension system or not making your pension payments, those were big things because in some states, the idea that you're supposed to have a balanced budget apparently doesn't include putting money in your pension system. And that then rolled over to cities and municipalities. So there's been a consistent pattern of states using financial gimmicks, selling state buildings to themselves and things like that. I actually wrote a story somewhere around 2010-11 after the last recession about all the gimmicks that states have used, and some of them are pretty creative. But what they really are meant to do is they are meant to get around the kinds of things like constitutional amendments, which voters the reason we have these constitutional amendments in state governments is because voters said, don't do this, right? And then they simply go ahead and use gimmicks to get around them. And the justification is, well, it's government and we have to deliver services. But the pattern is this. They'll justify doing this during a recession, but once the good times are over, they don't stop doing it. They don't pay back that debt. They just keep rolling it over, and it just gets bigger and bigger. And, again, we could talk for a long time.
The pension thing is a problem. I gave him my views on the pension and asked him to reply on that. And I will talk about what I think of it on the other side. But here's his comments on pensions.
Yeah, and the crucial thing is this. All of those things that you talk about, like paying people, like a 3-year average, and you can work overtime. The reason all of those things are allowable, in many cases, those things were voted on by the legislature over the years. The reason they're allowable is because there's no cost to them for the people in the legislature who are voting for them now. For some reason in states, the law says you don't have to fully fund your pensions, or you can skip your pension payments because it's an emergency. So Literally, you have years in which the legislature would say, well, we're going to add this pension enhancement because the unions came to us and said, we're going to add overtime. So now you can count overtime, we're going to do that. In that same year, they didn't make their full pension payment, right? So that's why they can grant these things, because there's been this tremendous exemption. And that's the easiest way to talk about it. We have these constitutional amendments. You got to balance your budget. But for some reason, that doesn't include certain things. And one of the big things it didn't include is the pension system. That's why there's so much debt in the pension system, because there's a loophole there to get around these constitutional amendments.
More with Steve on the other side. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing financial issues with Steve Malenga, the George M. Yeager Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Give us a call at 312-642-5600 and let us know what you think the solution to this fiscal crisis is. When we left, we were discussing pensions, and I did want to briefly mention what I said to him about pension because we came up against a break. And I want to start off by being clear that I think the people on these pensions, there's contracts and deals made, and they should get what they're owed and what they're promised. However, it doesn't make sense to pay thousands of people not to work. It's like we still think it's the 1930s and people go into a job, work the same career, don't leave that company for 60 years or whatever. And you have to factor in the fact that people simply live longer and you have to pay that money out for so much longer. So even if you think it's fair and it's a nice thing, it's simply not sustainable. And that's part of the problem when we're seeing that. But next, in addition to the pension problem, I asked him about the taxes and fees that make cities too expensive for many citizens to live. Some of them are unconstitutional, I believe, while others are regressive. Either way, they drive people out. Then you have to raise taxes to cover the money that they were paying when the people leave, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So I asked Steve, what part does this play on the crisis?
Well, first of all, you said taxes and fees, and I think that's actually very good because let's take a place like New York City. New York City is a very, very tough place to do business. If you make a lot of money, if you're a big financial firm, that makes money hand over fist, you're the kind of firm that will stay in the city for the importance of having a location in Manhattan, because you can afford those extra taxes and also the fees that it costs you, the fees for occupancy, the fees for regulations that you have to follow. The losers are the small businesses. I've spent a lot of my career writing about small businesses, and small businesses are the ones who, in these kinds of municipalities where you have a lot of the budget is actually paid for not just with taxes but with fees, you essentially have a kind of anti-business attitude that is most devastating for small businesses. And that's one of the reasons why, in particular, you get a lot of some of the biggest screaming and yelling comes from the small business community. And, after COVID, the small business community just about everywhere is going to be very different. It's going to be very fragile, and it's going to be very difficult for a lot of these folks to kind of revive themselves. And in a place like New York, we just at City Journal, we've just published another story about inspectors going around and giving tickets to small businesses, and these people are going out of business. And now they're being hit with new levels of fines and fees. So the real losers in this are I hate to say this, but the little guy. The little guy's a real loser, because if you're Goldman Sachs or somebody like that, you can afford this to stay. But it's the small businesses that are really under stress. And this recession, because of the nature of it, because of COVID, what it's added to it, this recession is tougher on small businesses than any other I've seen.
Now, I agree with him that this type of governance definitely hurts small businesses. But in trying to find out what the problem is, I think that a lot of it has to do with the government-minded people who think that creating more government jobs is the answer. So this is the way it goes. They make it harder for you and I to create a business or to manage it and keep it afloat. And then when businesses close, and people are struggling, those people who work at the businesses are trying to find jobs, they just say they can solve the problem by replacing those lost private jobs with more government jobs. So I asked Steve what problems are caused by those who tout government jobs.
It isn't just that they say the solution is more government jobs. They say the solution is more government. I'll give you an example. In New York City, they have programs to help small businesses. Help small businesses, why? Because they're struggling, in part because government makes business so difficult. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I wrote a series of stories about small businesses in New York City. And one of the things I did, I was somewhat naive. I looked at all the government programs that they had for small businesses. And as I would go around and talk to these small businesses and these associations, I'd say to them, oh, well, how about this program? Do you use this program? How about this program? How good is this program? And the reaction I got was, I never even heard of that program. Don't tell me about that program. Tell me about the taxes. Tell me about the fines. Tell me about the fact that, that I'm constantly having to pay bills for something else. And I realized then that basically what we have is we have places, cities where they make doing business difficult. And then when people scream about it, what government says is, okay, well, we're going to make it easier by giving you government programs instead of saying, well, we're going to make it easier by stop making it so hard on you. And that's the biggest problem. Government thinks that the solution is, as you said, more government. It isn't necessarily just more government workers. It's also more government programs. And these government programs aren't very good at helping businesses survive. But it's the solution to too much government is often from government people, more government. Look, in New York City, you have something like 190,000 small businesses. There isn't a government program out there that could begin to reach a fraction of those businesses that are suffering and that are struggling. But if you do things like you look at regulations that don't work, you look at licenses that people have to pay that are irrelevant, if you do things like that, you reduce regulations, everybody benefits from that. But a government program never going to reach a fraction of those 190,000 businesses out there.
Well, I get his point. I think what Steve is missing is that it's not the government program. It's the problem that they don't get it. So what we need, the solution is to simply create a new program that will explain the programs so the businesses can start using the programs. You see what I meant earlier about vicious cycle? So, I talk about the culture a lot. And so I had to bring this up and ask him about it because it's everywhere. And I say, so we got these areas. They're in a financial crisis. They're unprepared to get out. COVID hits to make it worse, and people are fleeing the states. Yet they are pledging money they don't have to fix, quote unquote, racism. You have, people trying to different governors in different states saying what they're going to do for black and brown people. You have Louisville's mayor calling racism a public health crisis. So I asked Steve, what part will, Blantifa and the white wokeness play in financial fiscal problems?
Two things. Number one is, let's take New Jersey as example. Governor Murphy said the same thing back in, I would say, June or July, and he talked about a whole bunch of new programs. They weren't actually very expensive, but when the new budget came out, he still didn't have the money for them because New Jersey is borrowing $4 billion just to keep its current budget going. They can't afford to spend new money. Second thing, though, is that a lot of this is window dressing. Politicians who want to get out front and make bold statements. And when you look at the amount of money that they're talking about in some of these programs relative to the size of their budgets, they're extremely small. What's a big budget item? If you want to basically end inequality, or I shouldn't say end, you want to narrow inequality, fix your school system. How about that, right? That would do more than anything else in many cities, give people choices, right? I'll give you an example here in New Jersey. The Newark school system, I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. The Newark school system has been a disgrace for years, and the critics have been from outside the community and within the community. Years is not right, decades is right. During Cory Booker's tenure, he really pushed the idea of school choice. Now, he didn't have the option of doing that. The state had to do it, but with help from the state, they began doing that extensively. They've gotten to the point in Newark where something like maybe 30% of the kids are now in schools charter schools where you have, as a parent, have a choice. suddenly school grades and marks and test scores are going up in the city. It's making a difference, So you want to talk about ending inequality, a program that, that some of these programs, when you look at them, it's basically, they're just adding money to create a study, and it's like hundreds of thousands or a few $1 million. And that's not going to change anything. Fundamentally, it's basic reform. And, you start with the kids and start with the school system. And we all know that the institutional impediments to reform there are very big. And if governors and mayors were really, really serious about change, right, they'd be starting there. But to do that, they would have to essentially confront the political forces, right, that protect those institutions. And a lot of governors and mayors aren't willing to do that. Some of them are elected by those forces.
Wow. Cory Booker supporting school choice? Oh, I bet he won't sing that tune now. More with Steve Malenga, senior editor at City Journal. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Nothing else matters.
Now, more of the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing the country's financial woes with Steve Malenga, the George M. Yeager Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And we were talking about cities where they're struggling and people are leaving, and what do they do to turn this around? And I try to assume positive intent, but the results do matter. So I asked Steve who is most likely to be hurt by the exodus these cities are experiencing.
Well, the thing is, a substantial number of people have the ability to vote with their feet. And this is an issue after COVID that's going to be accentuated. We've seen this in New York right now. The vacancy rate in New York City for apartments has tripled because of COVID. In particular, it's the richer people who have the money to leave. They also are the ones who pay a lot of the taxes. If those people don't start coming back to cities, it's going to be a real financial problem, a tax problem. It's going to be an economic problem. The problem also, though, is that the people who are stuck, who can't leave, who don't have a home in the Hamptons or something like that, they're going to do worse. But again, I go back to the example of Newark. Those people, many of those people in the city of Newark for years, they had to tolerate the schools because they didn't have the financial wherewithal to go somewhere else. Now, though, the city finally gave them a choice. The choice was within the city. Here, you have a choice to pick your school, okay? For a lot of people, middle income and upper income people, the choice was to leave the city, go somewhere else and pick a school, right? Pick another school district. In Newark, finally, they said, we're going to give you the choice. Camden, they've done the same thing, actually. So they gave them another kind of choice, right? So if you don't have the finances, you're stuck unless government says to you, we're going to initiate reform. We're going to knock down barriers. We're going to give you a choice. When you give those people a choice, they make the same kind of wise decisions that other people make. They just don't have the wherewithal necessarily to make those decisions if they're stuck somewhere.
Now, this is a key point. He says that COVID exacerbating the problem is going to be really bad and really tough on these cities if people leave and don't come back. But you may think he's some conservative guy and, he's thinking a different way. But he's not the only one who says that. In one of the earlier clips, he talked about Cuomo wanting to raise taxes. But, he was singing a different tune a couple months ago. Here is him in the summer. Please play Cuomo.
We used to be worried millionaires' tax people might leave. No. The burden shifted. We're trying to get people to come back. We're trying to get them to come back.
You see, Cuomo even said in a press conference, if we tax these people more, they won't come back and we'll be in trouble. So he knows that. So the fact that he wants to raise taxes is crazy in itself. But, these cities need to look out for the dangers that lie ahead because of their poor policies. But we got back to COVID. And so I simply asked Steve, should Congress do another stimulus?
Well, yes, definitely. But here's the thing. A lot of the talk is this kind of unfocused, general aid that goes to cities and states. I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't be giving stimulus money on COVID for fixing mistakes that you've made over the last 20 years. It should be very targeted. It should be targeted, first of all, at the healthcare systems that remain under stress. That's obviously number one, and we can measure that. Number two, it should be targeted at small businesses and individuals, particularly individuals who have suffered the most in terms of their personal finances because of the industries they're in, where they've lost their jobs. Let's say restaurant workers is a good example. Okay, we need to make it focused, and we need to make, because you can, I talked a little bit a while ago in the beginning about how people were having a big debate about how much of the problem is COVID and how much of the problem was already there. I think that in terms of people who need aid, you can actually make those decisions. You can say, we need more money for transit systems. That's clear. I mean, the New York City's transit system has lost 90% of its customers. Think about that. So yeah, I can understand that, so you can target it there. What some of these governors want, and the reason there's a big debate in Washington and there's a back and forth and they're not getting a bill done, is because they just want unrestricted aid. And people in Washington are saying, basically, you're asking us for a bailout for your pension system or something like that, and we don't want to give you that.
And that is the problem. See, as a conservative, people may think that, I don't like big government and I don't want them handing out a bunch of money and all this kind of thing, which is true. But I'm not crazy either. I mean, this is not like other situations. A lot of times, I think I've said this before, that people say, we help these companies out and then they go give their employees and their executives these big bonuses and all this other stuff. That's why we should give money directly to people. But this is different. It's like these businesses were running fine. They were operating in the black, and then the government came along and shut them down. So if you cause me to not have money and not have income and be able to pay my employees, then you need to do something about it. And all those who want direct payments, it sounds good, and it's necessary in some areas. But you're talking about giving people money. It's a temporary short-term fix. If I give you $2,000, pretty soon you're going to run out of money. You're going to come back to me. You're going to need more money. But if I keep the small businesses afloat, then you can go to work and then you can actually get continual paychecks. So I know a lot of people on the left hate giving money to businesses. They say give it to the people. But if you actually want it to work, you need to somehow, bail out these businesses that the government calls to close. Whether it be temporarily, that was their plan, but it's going to be long term. More with Steve Malenga, senior editor at City Journal. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing fiscal policy in the cities and states that are in crisis with Steve Malenga, the George M. Yeager Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of Shakedown, The Continuing Conspiracy Against the American Taxpayer. So when we left, we were talking about the stimulus. I asked him if we needed another one. He said yes. And kind of went in a little bit the direction of how that should happen. So it should be targeted, he said, which makes sense. It's probably going to be a combination of direct payments and payments to businesses. So that's why you see what's going on today. You see these politicians going back and forth. They fought for a long time on the stimulus, thought they had a bipartisan bill ready to go that everybody would be happy with. Trump didn't like it, and now they're kind of trying to struggle to see what to do next. And that's just because there's a different, philosophy to how to fix this. And it's a major, really big crisis. And, everybody has their own ideas. And like I said earlier, I assume positive intent. So I don't go in and saying these people are evil and these people don't care. But you got, one side that say, we got to help the businesses a little bit, but we are focused on direct payments. So if it's the $600, that's not enough. There's $2,000 and it's more. And then they want to do another one. Then the other side is saying, well, you shut down the businesses. You need to help them stay open. And so how to meet in the middle there. And that's not an easy thing to do. And, on top of all this, we just went through a crazy election year that was unlike any we've seen before. And we have an incoming administration in a couple of weeks. So I asked Steve what he saw coming forth in a Biden administration.
Right. And I would add something else. And see, unfortunately, this is such a crisis situation that we haven't been able to kind of design systems that really work. But I mentioned a couple of places like transit systems that obviously seen this tremendous decline, and also industries. Restaurants is a good example that they work on person-to-person contact. And so they're the ones that have suffered the most. One of the things we know, though, at the same time, is that the governments themselves have, even before COVID, created some of the crisis that we now see. I'll give you an example. I mentioned New York because it's the biggest transit system by far in the country. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority was in budget crisis before COVID. One of the reasons they're in budget crisis is because they have the kind of pensions and benefit system that is off the charts. And I'll give you an example. The average cost of employing a worker in the New York City transit system is something like $150,000 per worker. That includes benefits and so forth. It's astounding, the number. All right. If you compare it to like private transportation, meaning bus companies and stuff like that, those industries, it's more like $70,000 or $80,000. So it's an astounding number. So when the Metropolitan Transportation Authority calls for aid from Congress, what congressmen around the country say is, you've been paying your workers exorbitant amounts of money, well out of proportion to what it costs to actually bring people in to work for you. People line up to work for for all this time. So when are you going to reform yourselves? And that becomes a part of the whole discussion. They've made themselves vulnerable to this discussion because they haven't been employing good budgeting practices, good fiscal practices up to now. You can go back and read on our website, some of our experts, like Nicole Gelinas, who writes about the transportation around the country. She was writing about the budget crisis at the MTA a year ago. And there's a long list of things they've done to create this. And so what happens is, what muddies the discussion here is, we know these places need some money, but around the country, congressmen and federal officials will say, yeah, but you created this problem. When are you going to reform yourself?
Okay, see, so that was Steve giving us more detail on how to make, targeted assistance. But here's the clip on Biden.
That's a big question. I think, first of all, if you start with the whole pension issue, I think you have to find a way to restructure a lot of these pension systems. The thing is that a lot of state constitutions like Illinois and New York say you can never touch the pension system as it exists right now. So the part of the problem is, now we know we have a problem, but we can't fix it. In fairness, Illinois did pass a law to try to fix things, but the state constitution says you can't do that. The state Supreme Court said you can't do that. So we have to find a way, and there are federal ways of passing legislation which would allow them to restructure these pension systems and fix them. Because right now, places like California and New York and Illinois in particular, you can't even fix the system now that we know the problem is there. Part of the problem is that we said basically, if you make a mistake, you can't fix it. Never. So that's a big problem. And so I've written about this. There are federal solutions basically which would allow these pension systems to be put in kind of a receivership and restructured in a way that guarantees that the workers will get pensions, but also guarantees that the systems are viable going forward and that they don't bankrupt their municipalities. So I think, you need to do that. Part of the problem is that at this point, the politics of many cities in particular is actually going further to the left at a time when they're in fiscal crisis. I would argue that those two things don't work together really well, because the left wants more government and they want more government spending, and they've got all kinds of ideas about where to spend the money. And Chicago's a good example. In New York, we can see it coming too. These municipal elections coming up in 2021, I think the biggest gains are possibly going to be made by the Democratic Socialists of America, New York Party. Think about that. Even the unions are scared of that, believe it or not. So the problem is you've got fiscal problems, and you've got more and more left-leaning cities, and the combination of that really doesn't work right now because they're not actually addressing the reality. And the reality is that lots of these places need to be restructuring their spending, and instead they're just going on as if it's business as usual. And I think there's going to be a real reckoning, if you will, after COVID on this particular issue. And believe me, the politics of some cities in America, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, New York. It's really going to be, I guess if you say interesting, in the way that the Chinese say, may you be born in interesting times. Interesting, but a little bit scary, because those politics don't work very well with the fiscal situation that a lot of these cities are in right now.
Coming up, our final segment with Steve Malenga, senior editor at City Journal. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. This is our final segment with Steve Malenga, George M. Yeager Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And we have Dave on the line who has a comment about the budget and the financial crisis. But I want to go quickly to Steve's last comment here, where I asked him if there's a way out of the fiscal mess, COVID or even pre-COVID. And he had spoke earlier about city and state governments moving further to the left. So I asked if we have to wait for the pendulum to swing back. And here's his response.
Problem with that, Charles, is, for instance, having seen that in New York City during the 70s and 80s, the problem with that is there's so much damage is done as the pendulum is swinging one way before people realize that it's got to swing back, that it gets ugly. And we're seeing that already in a place like Seattle or Portland, for instance, in San Francisco. Do we really want conditions in cities to get to that extreme before people say we need to do something different?
No, I don't think we want that, but I just honestly think I do this because I think people will hear it and learn some different things and say, well, I was against that, but I didn't know that, so maybe I'll change. So the alternative, we're not going to stop fighting. So you and I and people like us having these conversations, just putting the information out there, we have to keep striving to do that, writing for City Journal, right? Your work at the Manhattan Institute, we have to keep doing that. But the biggest shift is going to be, it's just reality. It's going to be people in the middle, center left, center right, saying, what we're doing is not working. But I think we've done our little part for now. Hopefully people will get a takeaway from this of what the problems are, what they can do. He is Steve Malenga, author of Shakedown, the Continuing Conspiracy Against the American Taxpayer. And, your work at the Manhattan Institute is integral to solving some of these problems. So I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. It's been a good conversation. We don't really have a chance to have conversations like this very much on the radio.